All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Women in the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have Shamsa here. She is in Australia, and it was really fun to figure out time zones so we could make this interview happen. But I've been following her on LinkedIn, and I just really love particularly her Motivation Mondays, especially because it always comes out before because Australia's ahead of us. And so I always know I can see it on Mondays and be encouraged. And I don't know, I just am really excited to get to know more about you, and I always love doing international guests, so I'm just so excited that you're here.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to be here. And I feel like there's mutual fangirling happening because I'm a massive fan of your podcast, even on the other side of the world. The stories that have been on your podcast have touched women all over the world. And there's that unique sisterhood that comes from being a veteran, no matter what country you've served in. So thank you as well.
Yeah. I know, I was thinking about that earlier today of, like, how I was like, "I don't actually know this person, but I feel like I do because we're both veterans, even though we're not in the same country and our service story is different, but there is this sisterhood around the world, so it's really cool." So, I always start with why did you decide to join the military? So, why did you decide to join the military?
Well, like all good stories, it starts with a boy, doesn't it? So my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, he joined the military, and I was studying media and marketing at university. And he said, if you switch to business and join the Air Force, they'll pay for your degree. And being the poor uni student I was, I thought, well, that's a good enough reason for me. And so it all happened completely accidentally. It was never on the radar, and that turned into a 15-year journey.
Wow. So he just was like, "Hey, you should do this to get your schooling paid for," and you're like, "Sign me up."
Pretty much, yeah.
That's so cool. So, in the American military, they have, like, different ways that you pay for college. What's the process of getting your schooling paid for in the Australian Air Force?
Yes, so it was a undergrad scholarship. So there's a few ways that you can have your undergraduate studies paid for. One is going to the Australian Defence Force Academy, which is very similar to the military colleges you have, like West Point. The other way is to study at your own civilian university, and they will fund you with kind of the sign on agreement that you will then give them back a couple of years of your life at the end. So that was the way that I did it, which was really cool. So I still got to have the university experience in a civilian university, knowing that I had a guaranteed job at the end. And then once you're in, there's so many incredible education assistance packages. And so I also did my master's degree through the Air Force as well a bit later on.
That's awesome. And so did you guys both graduate and then join the Air Force at the same time, or what was that process like?
Well, my husband has a really interesting story. So he originally joined as a reservist, and then because he topped his initial training, they offered him a full-time position, and he switched across without chatting to his girlfriend at the time. So he suddenly became a full-time military member. We were doing long distance for a few years. He joined as a enlisted airman, and he was airfield defence guard. And when he was in Afghanistan, um, he saw the need for chaplains in the military to come with lived experience of being a soldier. So there was a lot of incredible chaplains who had come from all walks of religious life that had that wisdom and experience, but there weren't many that had actually commissioned and been on the front line and gone through all the things that you go through as a young airman. So he applied to commission from airfield defence guard to chaplain. And then the Air Force sponsored his undergraduate and his master's, and he topped Australia for both of those degrees. And now he's doing his PhD. And what I love about that story is that often enlisted personnel, and I hate those terms anyway, are told your job is to fulfill this tiny little role in this little portion of the Air Force or the military. But if you're surrounded by the right mentors and sponsors and coaches, you can really reach your potential. And now he is, he's doing his PhD, and he never would have thought that he would be there when he first joined. So I love that story about just wrapping someone in love and support and giving people opportunities.
Yeah, that is a really cool story. So it sounds like you guys were on like two very different paths. So what was your experience when you graduated? Do you have to go through military training? What is that experience like?
Yeah, so once I finished my degree, I started university quite young. I was 16 when I was at university. And so then I went to our initial officer training for Air Force, and then went through all my training, and then I was a young officer posted when I was just turned 19, and most of my sergeants had been in the Air Force longer than I'd been alive, times two in some cases. So certainly had that experience that a lot of young officers have, where you have to quickly work out how to be mentored by your subordinates, for want of a better word, but in the same way provide them the leadership that they need. And it's really tricky for young women going into that predominantly male dominated environment still with the senior non-commissioned officers. So that was my journey. I found myself at 19, posted to a unit that was in active operations, with a lot of people working for me that were much older than I. And I feel so blessed for that opportunity because it's such a formative leadership experience.
Yeah, I mean, 19 is so young. So young to I mean, officers are young anyways, but still the difference between, like, 19 and 22, 23 is a big jump, and so that's, like that's crazy, that's so young.
That's right. Well, I had my first deployment when I was 21. I was in Afghanistan when I was 22, and I was in the Middle East again when I was 24. And so by the time I got to 25, I was a very tired 25-year-old that had seen the very best and the very worst of humanity, but also really good and really poor leadership. And so I knew the kind of leader I wanted to be and the values that I was going to take with me, which is why I say there's very few better formative leadership opportunities than joining the military, because of the exposure you have, and the skills you have to develop so rapidly. Particularly people who joined when I did, sort of in the late 2000s, when there were so many active operations happening. Um, I feel so grateful for it. But yeah, I became very, very tired when I was about 25. I felt like I was 125.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your deployment. So you said first you went to Afghanistan and you had been in for about 2-ish years if you were 21, and
Yeah. So I'd actually deployed before I went to Afghanistan. I had already deployed to Papua New Guinea. And I had my 21st birthday in Papua New Guinea. And while I was there, the government wanted to stand up Manus Island and Nauru, which were two immigration detention centers essentially. And so they sent the Air Force to Manus Island and the Army to Nauru, and a bit of both to each of them. And it was a very politically sensitive, very challenging deployment. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance for a lot of us, because we didn't really want to be doing what we had been asked to do. Um, and I think as a young officer, your role in situations like that is to put an umbrella over your team and say, look, I'm not in control of the politics. I'm not in control of, we're pawns on a chessboard. But what I can absolutely do is love and protect my team and make sure they have the psychosocial safety that they need to achieve the aim and the mission. And so we worked really, really hard. We pooed in buckets and we lived in tents, and it was really tough. And it's very funny when people say, "Oh, you're in the Air Force. You had a uh, really comfy tour." And I think, well, let me send you some photos of what I was doing for my 21st. So by the time I got to Afghanistan, I'm glad I had that experience, because when I went to Afghanistan, it was in that really sort of hot time where there was a lot of things happening, and I felt much better prepared for it.
yeah. Yeah, when I deployed with the Army and I was in the Air Force, and, like, the people in the Army were like, "Oh, Air Force, you have it so nice." I'm like, "I'm on the same deployment as you, like, I don't know if you know this, but, like,
I don't have a
I live
butler in
in
my
a
tent.
tent." Right. I live in the
I
same tent you do.
If there's any comms people listening, I always know your secrets, which is that you have to have, the fridges to keep the batteries cool. But we know you've also got a few cans of Coke in those fridges. So always make friends with the comms people on tours.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it was just funny. Yeah, I was gonna ask that question like, "Oh, isn't Air Force supposed to be, like, a nicer life?" And you're like, "Yes, it is, but that's not what happened."
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so you went from there and then you went to Afghanistan, but you had learned a lot from that deployment experience that you were able to use when you were in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's right. And so Afghanistan was a very different context again. We were pulling out of Uruzgan province, handing over to the Afghan army. And I was actually working for the US Army as a contract officer representative. So I had a team of Afghan men that provided a variety of base services, and our job was to scale down those services so that we were still able to provide everything the forces needed up until the last day, but then there was nothing the day after. So that was a really big logistics lesson. So I was a logistics officer in the Air Force. I still am an active reservist. And that was really cool because how do you work in a multinational environment? Um, how do you, as a woman, provide leadership to a group of Afghan men? How do you, which actually was not very difficult at all, and I can talk about that. And then how do you also work with our NATO partners? And so we're all there for the same reason. How do we kind of get along? And as people know, there's everyone has their own, every country has their own systems and the way that they need to do things, and how do you work across them? And so I got to work really closely with my US counterparts, and I loved hanging out with them and hearing stories. And I think we all join the military for the same reason. I think it doesn't matter which country you belong to, you genuinely are joining to make the world a better place. And that is, not always what people's understanding of military members are. But I think that genuinely is why we all join. And I'm a pacifist at heart, but I really do think that, we make the difference in the small ways that we can, whether we can control the overall narrative or not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I do wanna go back to working with Afghan men as a young woman in the military because I didn't have any issues either, so I was curious, like, what was your experience like?
Yeah, and I don't know if you found that you kind of become androgynous once you're in uniform and you have a weapon and you're not male or female really, you're just someone else for them to deal with. Sorry. I'll start that again. So I think you find that, and I don't know if you had this experience, but when you're in uniform, you become androgynous. So you're not really male or female, you're just the person that they need to deal with. But I formed really close, beautiful relationships with my Afghan team, especially the supervisors, and hearing their stories. Some of the older men had supported. NATO forces on and off for years and years. They knew the game. And what was really cool is, as a Christian woman, I could use religion to kind of connect with them a little bit. So I think that for them, being Muslim, they really respected that I had a faith and that I could share Ramadan with them. I sat down for iftar with them, and their wives, found it hilarious that their husbands were working for this young woman and would send me lunch and send me gifts in. And I remember one moment where there was actually a US lieutenant, a dude who had stuffed up a little bit, and I was sort of yelling at him, and I was knife handing him a little bit, and I paused and realized that all my Afghan contractors were behind me, well, a group of them. And I thought, oh my gosh, they've just seen this woman yelling at this man. And so I paused and I turned around, and they were just laughing their heads off. They found it so funny that I just stood up for them and had their back. And that was actually a moment where the game kind of changed, and they really respected me and I respected them. And so like I'm Palestinian anyway, so I already kind of look a little bit Arab, and there was just a nice recognition of the similarities that we have in humanity, rather than the differences, and we're all here for the same reasons. So yeah, that was my experience, and I had a great time, and I like with them, and I really enjoyed being able to smuggle some Tim Tams to them to take home to their family, or, even just grab a spare box of pens, for them to chuck in their car. Just all those little things, because I knew that I was leaving and going home, and they weren't. They were living with whatever we left behind. And that was a responsibility that I took very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, especially because you guys were pulling out, and so that was, like, in your face. Yeah, that was one of the problems I had when they were, like, interrogating some of the people on at the fob that I was at. They, like, acted as if, like, they didn't live off base. I was like, "We live on the base, and we're always in safety. They have to go off base and, like, survive." And so, like, maybe they do some questionable things, but, they have to survive. And the people that I was talking to who were doing the interrogating, like, they didn't quite understand the connection. They were like, "No, it's good or bad." And I'm like, "No, there's, like, this middle ground of, like, I have to survive, so, like, I need to take care of my family, and, like, maybe that means I'm gonna do something I don't wanna do." But and so it was kind of frustrating because we had engineers we worked with, and they were, like, interrogating them, and I was like, "Yeah, they have to go home to their families, like, I don't understand, like, why you're and they're supporting us, and they're doing work for us, and they send us they're, like, doing everything they're supposed to. Why are you terrorizing them and trying to get information? And it just rubbed me kind of the wrong way.
A lot of them are putting their lives at risk, to work with the US military because, the enemy in most conflicts, when you employ local engaged civilians, they know exactly who's working on the base, where their family live, and they're taking a big risk because they genuinely want to contribute to making their country safer. And I think that that's such a heroic, morally courageous thing to do. And I felt a very deep sense of responsibility for my team. It was very obvious where I was as well in Tarankau in Uruzgan province because the base was essentially in the town. It wasn't like we were, 50 kilometers away from anything. You could see people walking from their homes to work. And I think it's very important to not get lost in, the fog of war, but to actually remember why you're there and that we're talking about real human lives.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that sounds like such a unique and interesting experience, and I've always been told it was like I was a third sex, but I like androgynous better, but it was like there's, you know, males, females, or Afghan females, and then American females, which are different than Afghan females, which is another, like, good way to, the men in Afghanistan were like, "Well, we have to deal with them," and they were used to it, and I just never really had an issue with that, so
Oh yeah, in some ways you're respected more than a lot of the white guys in the military that you're serving in that you need to deal with. And I
right.
mean, especially in Islam, women are very highly regarded and very well protected. And I certainly felt very loved and cared for. And if I was ever up on up at the burn pits or whatever, just by myself and my contractors, I knew that if anything went down, that they would absolutely protect me, and they knew that about me as well. And that mutual respect is the only way that you can get anything done, especially in a place like Afghanistan where the rules don't matter and it's all about,
Right.
the wheeling and the dealing, and you become a very, very good negotiator and you learn to think on your feet very, very quickly. And so I was really grateful for those lessons that I learned again, at 22 years old. So then by the time I got to my third deployment, I was absolutely an expert in getting what was needed, getting that done.
And so where did you go for your 3rd deployment?
Yeah, so my third deployment was in the United Arab Emirates. When we launched our coalition efforts against Daesh, uh, the Australian military rapidly deployed a series of platforms, including our air-to-air refueler, our KC-30A, and that at the time had not reached full operational capacity. So it wasn't properly deployable yet. There were a number of modifications that hadn't been delivered. But because we wanted our fighter jets refueled by our aircraft, and there was a series of other political reasons, we deployed it a bit early. So I went over as the logistics officer to support that, and making sure that the contract could support having a airframe overseas. That was a really cool experience because that was at Al Dafra, which is a huge, American presence, and there's French, and it's a whole number of countries there. That was a much more you're more removed from the front line there because you're that one step back, and it allowed me to really just be in the moment a bit more and enjoy the deployment. I really enjoyed watching US military culture in full display, in a more sustained deployment environment where there's a bit, you have there's full structures. People stay there. Is it 12 months that they do a tour there, I think? And so everyone's a bit more settled in. The US messes just crack me up, like Lucky Charms cereal. What even is that? That's not a breakfast food. That marshmallows, and the wings Wednesdays and the taco Tuesdays, and I just fully leaned into it. And I leaned into Emirati culture as well, and I really just wanted to participate fully because I knew that when I got back from that deployment, I would probably settle down and start having my children that my husband had been nagging me for. So I really wanted to make sure that I went out feeling like I had seen it.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, I remember I had a Dr. Pepper when I was in Afghanistan, and we had French people on the fob, and he was like, "What are you drinking?" And I was like, "Dr. Pepper." And he's like, "Pepper in a soda? This doesn't make any sense." And I was like, "Oh, no, the name has nothing to do with it. It's all just sugar." But it was
I
really
thought that cornbread was a dessert, because it was so sweet. There was like this syrup on it, and I was like, "Oh, we're having, some dessert." And everyone was like, "No." And even, the bread was sweet, and I had deployed as well, like, I had been on exercise to Guam beforehand, and I'd seen, the big Navy exchange, and, there's a you can buy a car in a shopping center. This is a car. And I just loved the everything is big, everything is sweet, everything's a lot kind of US culture that exists in the military. I really liked going to the US chapel services, and people volunteer to be in the worship band, and Australia doesn't really have that kind of culture in the military.
Okay.
So yeah, I really enjoyed the quiz nights, the poker nights, the silly shenanigans that go on. They tried to host a Australia kind of dinner for us to sort of welcome us. And they got the biscuits, like biscuits and gravy that you have, and tried to turn that into scones for us. Scones aren't particularly an Australian food anyway, they're more of a British food. We appreciated the effort with the mock cream, and we don't really do mock cream. I just loved that there was that attempt to be hospitable, and I really enjoyed that.
In a very American way where we're like, "We're really trying," and you're like, "You're not doing very well at all, but we appreciate it."
100%.
Silly Americans, that's us, yeah. I remember, like, at Manus, which is where I went before I went home from Afghanistan, it was, like, more removed, and they did, like, karaoke nights, and I was there during Halloween, and they did, like, dress up nights, and I was like, "This is like a party, this is not a deployment."
It's funny, in Afghanistan, you reminded me. So I also was responsible for a whole bunch of other base services, and one of them was the fuel farm where you could refuel, your vehicles. And the person that ran it his name was Jerry, which is hilarious because of jerry cans and fuel. Like just, they were made for it. Um, and they were a ladyboy by night and invited me to their birthday party. And so I followed, it was a bit naughty and I probably wasn't meant to go, but I went out of our compound to go to his birthday party. Went under, kind of down and in, and it was all the kind of the queer community that had from all the contractors in one room doing karaoke, Britney Spears, Hit Me Baby One More Time. And it was just the best night. And once the contraband alcohol came out, I did have to leave because I really didn't want to have to be doing paperwork the next day. But I just loved those cultures that exist, those subcultures that exist within the culture of the base. And I think in its heyday, had thousands and thousands of people, but that by the time I was there, it was quite small. Camp Cole had shut down, for anyone that's familiar with the base, and it really was just all of us together in one small area. So we really just bonded over enjoying each other's cultures, and yeah, that cracked me up, that birthday party.
Yeah. That's a memory you won't ever forget. But it is really cool to, like, get to experience different cultures in a country that's not your own and just, experience it in such a unique way.
That's right.
So it sounds like when you came home from that deployment, you decided that it was time to have a family, so is that what happened next?
Yeah, so we, had our fertility issues, and that a lot of women go through, but we got there in the end, and we had two babies. So I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old at the moment. And then I posted to a few other places, and still did exercises and went away. And then I went to Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. A lot of people think it's Sydney, and it's not. And then I did some strategic roles, and I really loved the strategic stuff. I think being able to apply what you've learned on the ground and contribute back to policy development and big contracts. I really appreciated that time I had as well, and it allowed me the space to then have my babies and return to work.
That's great. Did in the military here in the US in the past, I guess, 5 or so years, they've really changed the maternity policy and even, like, how quickly you have to deploy. So what kind of time frame do they give you time off? Do they have a set window when you have to be ready to deploy again?
Yeah, there's been a lot of women who have been championing this. So, for example, the Air Force became one of the first accredited breastfeeding military branches in the world. Um, the maternity leave. I mean, the maternity leave in Australia is quite good anyway in terms of government maternity leave, and I feel so sorry about hearing the stories about women in the US who pop their baby out, and 14 days later they come back to work. I think that's just really hard. And I think you're all amazing. And if anyone listening has done that, I can only imagine as a mother how and like how frustrating it is to manage that system, and even just the cost of having a baby in the US. And yeah, I was very shocked by that. So we have, yeah, very good maternity leave policy, but also paternity leave. So fathers can also take an extended period of time off. When you come back to work, you're still medically downgraded, and you work with your medical team to work out when you should be upgraded. There's really no pressure to come back and be fully medically deployable. In terms of actual deployments, I mean, the way that our military works is quite, we're not deployed as much as the US is, in terms of there's no need to deploy necessarily if you're in a general sort of role, especially at the moment. So there's a lot of flexibility. So I mean, I think it's probably a bit different in the Army perhaps, or the Navy, where you've got sea time, but the Air Force is known for being a little bit more family friendly. And I was really lucky because I was a dual serving member, so my husband totally understood what I was going through. And I returned to work after 4 months with my first, and I was able to work from home 2 days a week, so I could still breastfeed and all that kind of stuff. With my second, I had gotten promoted while I was on maternity leave, and I thought, well, I don't need a performance report this year, so I'm going to take the rest of the year off. And so I had a year at home, and that was really, really nice as well. But like most women in the military, I was very type A, very career ambitious, and I wanted to get back to work. And I think it's just about choice. It's just about women having the choice to do whatever they want. There's no right or wrong. We just want to make sure that whatever works for you and your family, you should be able to have access to that.
Yeah. That's awesome, that's great to hear. Yeah, the military when I had my son, you got 6 weeks, and my husband got 10 days, which I guess is better than nothing, but now both husband and wife, or, whatever the couple is, both parents get 12 weeks of maternity leave, um, or paternity leave, and that's, like, so amazing, but then you're like, "I had the whole year." I'm like, "Oh my goodness, that would be so amazing."
Yeah, you
But
can take up to 12 months, leave without pay as well, or use your long service leave, and they'll hold your spot for 12 months. Is it the same in the States?
you get 12 weeks, it's paid maternity leave, and then if you wanna take longer, you would have to use your own leave. I don't know how much longer you could do, but
Mm.
but
They've even
12
got
weeks.
things
Oh,
like miscarriage leave now, or adoption leave, and just acknowledging that families operate in all different ways now.
yeah.
The miscarriage leave, some of my friends have actually used that, and that's just been a nice acknowledgement of what their body is going through, and their what psychologically they're going through. I think that that's a really nice change as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I interviewed someone, she was in the Marine Corps, and she talked about having a miscarriage, and, like, she went, and had the DNC, and then they were like, "Okay, go back to the office," and she was like, "I just, lost my baby," like, and it wasn't even really considered, like, mental health. It was just like, "Well, you're physically fine," and we're like, "But I just," so it's good to hear that things are changing because, you need that mental space, and then you also need, to allow your body to heal from such a traumatic event that would happen, so yeah.
And I think that militaries are, certainly all over the Western world, are really experiencing a recruitment and retention crisis. Certainly, we are in Australia, and so it's not even just a nice to have or being woke or whatever. It's actually about retaining top talent. Like, especially if you're a sergeant, or you're a squadron leader, and you've been in for 15 years. They've invested so much, and especially in the military, they can't just recruit a sergeant straight in, right? It takes time to grow those incredible women who are usually having babies around that point in their career. So they absolutely need to be, top of class in terms of the benefits they offer, or people will just go somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we are definitely having a recruiting crisis here as well, so it's not any different in the States. They're trying to figure out why, but it's hard because, I mean, I think the maternity leave changes that they made since when I got out would have really changed, like, how I looked at getting, because it was 6 weeks of maternity leave, and then you had to be ready to deploy at 6 months, and I was like, "I can't leave behind my six-month-old." Like, so it was like a non-starter, and that was like the driving factor for why I got out. But now it's 12 weeks and then a year before you have to be ready to deploy, and that changes the story. So it's a big
And,
difference now.
and I don't know if if it was the same in the US, but during COVID, we also proved that flexibility doesn't change productivity. I mean, there's a lot of roles where you cannot work from home because you're literally driving the ship or whatever it is. But I think the expectations from both the workforce and employers have changed now, and women are demanding flexibility. If you want my brain and my skills, you're going to have to make it work for my family. Yes, I'm in the military and I'm loyal to you and I want to give you everything, but I can only do that if you allow me to work from home, on a Friday or whatever it is. And so, certainly in that post COVID world, we demand that flexibility where possible, I think.
Yeah, I've seen that change in the military. I mean, there are certain jobs that you can't do from home, and like that's not the part that's the problem. It's like, well, if I could do this from home, why can't I? And it's really better for my family and just working with families to figure that out. And I think that's a big change that will help with retention and keeping people in because if they can have more flexibility, then it has a huge impact. So. So you served for about, did you say 15 years? And then now I was looking at the dates. Now I'm like, I don't even know where I got that number from. But you served and then now you're in the reserves, right?
Yeah, so I transitioned 3 years ago, but I actually transitioned 2 years ago, but I left 3 years ago. So I promoted really quickly, and I really loved my job. Uh, but I became aware that I was on the production line of generals. So if I just passively sat there, I would go to command and staff course, and then I would take my next job, I'll promote, I'll just kind of move along, and then I would wake up in my late 40s and be a one star or something and go, oh, have I actually actively participated in my career? And so what I wanted to do was take 12 months leave without pay and just go and see what the kind of the real world, for want of a better term, was like, and whether my skills were transferable. At the time, I was the logistics specialization capability officer, which means that my job was to advise from at a strategic level, how do we retain and develop our logistics workforce, and so it made sense that I should test that. So with the military's blessing, which was amazing, I took 12 months off and I went to a big four consulting firm, which is funny because I had been a client of the big four consultants and the way that they kind of have maneuvered their way into defense. And I always said, I'm never going to work for a gross capitalist big four consulting firm. And so it's hilarious that I went, but it was an incredible way to do it, especially for a veteran, because if you don't know what you want to do when you grow up and you join a big consulting firm, you're able to move around and provide service to a whole bunch of different clients and kind of find out your groove rather than going to one company where you're locked into the work that you do. So I went in there, but because I was on leave without pay, it created a probity issue and I couldn't do any defense consulting. And that's exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to just go back and sell Tupperware back to my girlfriends. I really wanted to stretch and push myself. And so I then took that year off. I did some work. I got into the social justice space. I was supporting a few different royal commissions, and I ended up doing a lot of First Nations work. And that really opened my eyes to the work that needs to be done in reconciliation in Australia between our Indigenous peoples. And at the same time, I got promoted to director within 10 months of being at Deloitte. So when the end of my 12 months came up, I really had a choice to make. I got offered an incredible role, which would have been my dream role usually in the Air Force. And I think a lot of people probably had these decision points in your life where you're like, every decision is awesome. What do I do? At the same time, this is a bit of a trigger warning, but my sister-in-law had died by suicide. I'm on the other side of the country, back in my hometown, and left behind her two little babies. And I thought, do you know what? I need a job where I have the absolute flexibility to support the family. We moved back across to our hometown, and the Deloitte, which was the consulting firm I was with, supported that. At the same time as well, Australia was having a referendum around whether we should have a constitutional voice to Parliament for our First Nations people. And so, because of the role I was in at the time, which was a chief of staff role to Indigenous uh, senior partners within the firm, I had exposure to this incredible history shaping constitutional reform conversation. And I thought, wow, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I decided to stay with Deloitte, which meant that then I did transition. So I think I didn't leave because I was running away from anything. I left because I was running towards something. Um, I absolutely still love the military. I bleed blue. I love watching those TikTok videos with the aircraft marshals, marshalling in the planes and they're dancing. And I love the smell of aviation fuel when I smell it. I really, really love the military, and I'm so, so grateful for the opportunities I've had. And I still am actively involved in supporting women who are currently serving and also who are separated. So that's kind of how it ended up here. Um, and I mean, you always have sliding door moments in your life. It's never about, which path is better. It's just about which one can you live with not exploring. And I felt like I'd had my best years as a junior officer in the military. And I don't know that being a senior officer would really be as fun as being a junior officer. Honestly, I think I just joined an awesome time and had awesome experiences. And so maybe one day I'll go back. The good thing about the Australian military is the door's always open. It's very easy to move in and out, and they recognize your seniority on the outside. So they appreciate that the skills you gain as a director in a consulting firm, are translatable. And we need that. We need people that move in and out of the organization because that makes us better clients of the defense industry and better advisors to government.
Yeah, I think that's something that the American military needs to have more flexibility on, like allowing you to go and see what's out there and then learn what you've learned and come back because there is, the civilian side is very different than the military side. And if you just have people who've only been in the military leading, then there's a piece that's missing. So that's interesting to learn how different, the culture is in the military and just the different way to do it. It's like, "Oh, maybe we should be considering that too." So, yeah,
Yeah,
because I
and
know that
go ahead.
they just it was like a couple they said they were, like, trying to get people who were retired to come back, and it was, like, only the certain window, and it was so, like, restrictive, and it didn't make sense. Like, I was reading it, I was like, "No one would ever do this," but yours sounds like it makes sense.
They're very different militaries as well, like the size, the scale, the work they do, where they operate. And we're a very small defence force. I think we're classed as medium now. Um, but we have a bit more agility, but we have less capability. And so I think we're able to be a bit more flexible because we don't have to produce the kind of scale that you do. Um, and so I think it is funny sometimes that just because you speak the same language as another country doesn't mean that the culture's the same or like the military's the same. And and even in terms of rules of engagement are different. So yeah, it's very funny. We're quite aligned with our Commonwealth nations. I think like the UK military are looking at these kind of things, and the Canadian military, New Zealand. But I think the US, you have just your levers are a bit more difficult to pull from what I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it makes sense because you guys have that, like, close bond, between the countries. We got to go to New Zealand, and it was just so amazing to, like, go to that country and, like it was when the World Cup was happening for rugby, and they were, like, winning it was a long time ago, but it was, like we were just, like, welcomed into the New Zealand community, and we were cheering along for rugby, which we had no idea what was going on, but it was just so fun to be there, and so, yeah.
Oh, you remind me of the AFL grand final when I was deployed and the Americans were sitting with us and they had no idea what was going on with our Australian rules football, but they were just so encouraging anyway, which again is just the American way of just giving love and support, even if it doesn't totally make sense. And so, yeah, that was a very fun night. You reminded me of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just fun to be, like, part of something and to just celebrate together, and, like, we can all get excited even if we have no idea what's going on, we're like,
Yeah,
"We'll
I watched
cheer
the
for
Super
you."
Bowl. Yeah, Super Bowl in Guam. Had no idea what was going on. Happy to be there. But now,
Yeah.
thanks to Taylor Swift, everyone knows what the Super Bowl is. So thanks,
That's
Taylor,
funny,
for educating us all.
yeah, that's awesome. Um, is there anything else from your time in the military or, that you wanna share? I always will end with my advice question, but anything before that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to tell you a little story about creating change when it feels impossible to create change. So I did a lot of work in the military post Broderick Review, and the Broderick Review was exposed a whole bunch of cultural issues around sexual assault and sexual harassment against women in the ADF. And after that, that triggered a whole series of initiatives, and I participated in leading some of them. And I became really passionate about progressing women in the military and gender equality in the military. And that thread has followed me my whole career, and I became trained as United Nations Gender, Peace and Security Advisor, and I then ended up leading the national practice for gender equity at Deloitte. But in between all of that, myself and another lady called Major Lindsay Freeman in the Army was saying that we were sitting there one day and we said, there's nothing really online for women in the military in an Australian context on how to be just badass in our career. There's a lot of stuff out there about leadership in the military, and there's a lot of stuff for women in other contexts. Like the US has some fantastic resources, but the context is very different. And so we both thought we would just put a few articles online around goal setting, mentoring, personal branding. How do you do all that in the military? Because it looks very different to in a civilian world where you have a bit more control over your career. So we put some articles up, and we hosted it on a website called Grounded Curiosity, that's also founded by a badass female colonel, and she was very gracious to let us host on there for free. And then what happened next was unexpected. So we started getting emails from women saying, "Hey, I love that you've created this publishing platform in this space. Could I please share my story?" And we thought, well, we didn't really mean to create a publishing platform. We just put our thoughts online, but we realized we'd accidentally curated a safe space for women to talk about their experiences, sometimes for the first time, and share them. So we decided to go all in on it, and we started publishing women's stories, interviewing women, capturing things that were happening, and creating a little community. And it grew and grew. It got some notice because we won a few national awards for it. And it eventually has become the most read career development resource for defence women. But the readership is not just defence women, it's international. We have international authors, including US authors on there, but also men are reading it, people in defence industry are reading it. It got so big we had to bring on two editors, and now myself and Lindsay have actually stepped away from it because it's outgrown us, and it was never about us anyway. And now we've had to kind of let our baby fly. And it was really cool to see that we just had this idea. We knew we couldn't change, the whole culture of the Australian Defence Force, but we thought, what could we kind of do in our little bubble? And that created a little snowball. When Lindsay was in the Middle East the year before last, she saw posters for Propel Her, which is what it's called, stuck up on the mess. And just that feeling that we've created something bigger than ourselves was really cool. And so what I love about that story is sometimes it feels really big to create change and to make a difference, but you can just have small ideas that can have ripple effects. And I really want to encourage people listening that if you've got a good idea, find someone to sponsor it, and just make change right where you are. Because if we all just made little changes, that's how a culture changes. It's just a collection of the acceptable behaviors. That's all culture is. And so I'm really, really proud of Propel Her. And I'm really excited to see how it keeps growing. But I wanted to share that with your listeners.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you did, because I think I remember you guys talking about it, or you talking about it on LinkedIn, and it's just amazing. And it just kind of reminds me of like when I started the podcast and I started letting women share their stories, and the response was like, I've never told my story to anyone. And it's like, oh, well, we definitely need to tell your story, and here's a platform. And so it's been really amazing to get the opportunity to share stories of women, and like it's just crazy to me that people, in Australia are listening to the podcast. It's just amazing how we're connected. And then I've learned so much about the history of military women, and I'm working to share more stories of the history. And it's just like one little idea, and then it grows, and it just some people are like, "Well, you've done so much." I'm like, "In 6 years, not like in a day. I didn't do it in a day. I didn't write a book and start a like, it's been years and years of work and lots of little things that have added up." And so it's really cool. So I'll link to that in the show notes so that people can find it easily, because it sounds like such a great resource, and now I wanna go start reading it. It just sounds so good. So sorry, it's late here. I'm getting tired, but I'm really excited to hear the answer to my last question, which is, what advice would you give to young women who are considering joining the military?
Oh, this is a really good question. And I know I'm getting old because now I actually do advise, women that were born in 2002 on how to join the military. I would just say absolutely go for it. Just grab the opportunity. You're never going to be in a situation again where you get to be at the bottom of a massive tree that you can climb. So go in there with humility, with curiosity, take no crap from anyone, and most importantly, find your tribe. There, like any workplace, there's people that a little bit nonsense, and that's fine. What you need to do is find those strong women, both senior to you and at the same level as you, and just wrap yourself in their love and support. And finally, when you get to the top and you get to be one of those senior women that you look up to, don't forget to reach down and pull up all the junior women because before you know it, you're going to blink. And Amanda and I have both, we've blinked once and now here we are. So you're absolutely going to be in a position where your experiences and your sponsorship is going to be critical for the next generation. And finally, just remembering that you're in a long line of women who have pioneered for change in the military for decades. Because of the women who came before us, we can stay in the military after we get married, or we can have a baby and we don't have to leave, and all those things that were only happening sort of 30, 40 years ago. So move the mountains slightly, just move a tiny little change so the women after you can keep climbing as well. That would be my advice.
I love that so many good things that you, like, talked about, especially I love the ending because, it is women making tiny little changes that have, like, added up over time to I mean, in the US now you can serve in any career field and you can there's so many opportunities for women, and it's all because of, like, so many women making little tiny changes, so thank you so much for being a guest. I'm really excited that we got to meet. I'm like, one day I'll go to Australia and we can meet in person. That would be amazing. But I'm really just so glad that we're connected on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Amanda. And there's absolutely a warm cup of tea waiting for you whenever you come down under. There's lots of listeners who would love to be able to welcome you. So thank you so much for your time and for staying up so late and making the time zones work.
No problem. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.